Hello and welcome back to Ontology Explained. I'm Casey Hart, philosopher and ontologist, and today we're continuing that quest to find artificial intelligence. This time we've got a book. We're going to use John Haugeland's Artificial Intelligence, the very idea, as our inspiration. He gives us one on the second page. He says that AI wants only the genuine article, machines with minds in the full and literal sense. Excellent. And this is distinguished from Turing's or the 56 DARPA conference-inspired definitions we looked at. So Turing just needs something that can pass the imitation game, right? Something that can do a good enough job that it will trick people into thinking that it itself is human. And in the machines with intelligence definition from video number 2, the idea was that if it can do something that were a human to do it, it would be counted as intelligent. We should count the machine as artificially intelligent. Haugeland's not interested in just mere, it can imitate a human, or it can do something that might trick us to think it was a human. Now, this has to be the real deal. We're going to start with a high-level point that Haugeland makes, boosters versus scoffers. Then we are going to do a philosophical interlude. We're going to set this up going way back to Copernicus and moving our way through to Hume. Then we're going to talk about good old-fashioned AI, GOFAI. And then we're going to give his definition, think about its pros, and think about its cons. Let's start with the boosters and scoffers distinction. Haugeland says, look, there are going to be people that no matter what happens are ecstatic about artificial intelligence. They're going to sing its praises. It's going to beat everyone in chess. And in fact, now it's doing it. It's so much better than Magnus Carlsen. And AGI is right around the corner. And it's going to change everything. And we should give them billions of dollars. Conversely, we have scoffers. We have some people that say, oh, well, it'll never be able to have a feeling, or it'll never be able to be creative. And while those things might be true and you could make a compelling argument for it, you have to separate out the people who are making those compelling arguments versus just the naysayers who think that artificial intelligence is terrible and they're just curmudgeons about it. We don't want boosters. We don't want scoffers. There is a legitimate and interesting question here about whether machines can think. And from Haugeland's perspective, we don't know what the answer to that question is, but we should be interested and pursue the answer to that question rather than just hype it up or push it down whenever someone gives us any sort of suggestions. I hope that's something that I've lived up to on this channel. I would say I tend to be on the more skeptical side because I come in contact with more of the boosters, but hopefully we can find a happy medium here. My favorite part, of course, I'm going to do a lot more philosophy on this channel, but for now, this I think is going to be the most in-depth philosophical story that we get through. And Haugeland does a good job here of saying, look, I have to tell a huge history. I'm interested in the philosophy. The book it's not that big. So he can't do everything from Aristotle and do a full unpacking of how Kant might have thought about artificial intelligence. Instead, he wants to tell a particular story and follow this through time, and there'll be some people skipped over, there'll be some nuances missed, but there's a narrative here that he thinks is really important, and I'm going to do an even more abbreviated version of that. So if you hear me say something, you're like, that can't be right, or that's not a good interpretation of Copernicus, well, first off, drop it down in the comments. I'd love to see what you think is sort of the big deviation, but you're probably right. I just want to be true to what he has to say, but also give you as an audience a quick and dirty feel for how the philosophy breaks down here. So let's start with Copernicus. Copernicus is famous for saying the geocentric model is not the right way to go. Instead, let's take a look at a heliocentric model. And this was revolutionary, of course. It got him in trouble with the church. But he noticed that if we put the sun at the center of the universe instead of the earth at the center of the universe, a whole bunch of things make a lot more sense. And this is important, in the history of science and astronomy and the way we think about physics, obviously very important. But for Haugeland, what's important here is that there's a breakage between, it's not just that, okay, the heavens are above and the earth is below, and the earth is the center of focus, obviously. And so our ideas just need to match those of the heavens. No, we sort of shattered that paradigm and realized, wait, that's not what's going on. And the other thing that was really important here is we see the sun rise and the sun set, but if the sun is the fixed object at the center of the universe, then that means that my mental perceptions of the world are misleading. They're somehow different from the way reality is. There's this breakage between what the mind is seeing and what's actually going on in reality. And then we have Galileo, who follows this up. And Galileo not only improves upon the physics, but he does it mathematically. He uses geometry and proofs to argue that things that move in a constant velocity over time will move the same distance as something that is uniformly accelerated over that period of time, when we can look at areas under the curves, stuff like that. These geometric proofs show that not only can we understand the natural world, but we can understand it by means of symbols and symbol manipulation. And then we go to Hobbes. Nope, not that one. Yeah, that one. So Hobbes, in his Leviathan, then gives us a masterful political treatise, but he also takes what Copernicus and Galileo did in thinking about how the mind is different from the world. We can use symbol manipulation to understand things. And Hobbes applies that philosophically to human thought and says that human thought itself, ratiocination, is computation. That is, thinking is a manipulation of symbols. And this is going to be obviously essential when we're talking about artificial intelligence and thinking about whether machines and symbol manipulators themselves are doing thinking. So for that reason, Haugeland calls Hobbes the grandfather of artificial intelligence. Then we get to Descartes, and unlike Hobbes, who was a great philosopher, and Galileo and Copernicus, who are incredible physicists and mathematicians, Descartes is both. He's the father of modern philosophy, and he is a fabulous mathematician, and he's able to sort of unify these themes. He's really famous for his dualism, which is that you have the mind and you have the body, and these are separate substances. The interplay between them is difficult and important. Descartes thought there's something about the ethers going on in the pineal glands that is regulating this. But again, we have this division between mind and body and how they are regulated. And Descartes is very big on taking proofs and arguments and applying that to thinking and philosophical thought and epistemology for being certain about things, the development of the sciences. Then we have Locke. Locke is a continuation of what's going on in Descartes. Again, crazy oversimplifications here, but the relevant piece for the story that Haugeland wants to tell is that Locke is famous for his exposition of the difference between primary and secondary qualities. So when you take an object and you look at it, it has mass, it has hardness, and these are qualities, they're features that are in the object itself. It has extension and a resistance when I push on it. Great, that's in this object. But the color of this object, its blackness or its temperature, those aren't in the object themselves. And the way that Locke gets at this is that different people might perceive them differently, right? If we change the color of lights around us or dim the light, the color is no longer there, at least not in the same way. It's difficult to see. And the temperature of this laser pointer or my glass of water might feel warmer or cooler depending on how hot or cold I am, right? So it depends on the state of the observer. And this distinction between primary and secondary qualities, again, gets to the fact that there are things out there in the world, and there are things by the perceiver, and we need an account for how those things get from one place to another. And this is that mental and physical split. And then many people's favorite philosopher and the father of the philosophy of psychology and philosophy of mind, Hume. So Hume moves forward and treats ideas with the same sort of rigor that Newton wanted to treat physics. So we think of ideas as like particles that are in the mind, and they bump each other and they combine with each other in various sorts of ways. Hume's incredibly important, but for Haugeland, we're interested in Hume as maybe the father of artificial intelligence, or maybe some sort of godfather of artificial intelligence. He's the next big picture, so we go Hobbes to Hume in sort of that patriarchal lineage of artificial intelligence. So what's going on in this story? Three main themes that I want to focus on. The first is that minds are separate from the world. And we can see this in a bunch of different ways, but obviously we can be deceived, right? We thought the sun was rising. It wasn't. That's not what was going on. And the objects have primary and secondary qualities. We can hallucinate. There's different levels of engagement that we have with the world around us. And then the next piece, as we're sort of introducing this mind as a separate entity, is that our mind is thinking about the world, and this thinking is computation. This is that Hobbesian line, and we realize that we can combine and manipulate our ideas. language is symbolic, right? We write out the words, and our language is a way of expressing our thought. We can think of thought as itself being symbolic in the same way that language is. And the third theme and real problem here is, okay, so we have now the mind as separate from the world and it's symbolic, or at least approximated as being symbolic. But there's a real puzzle, which is, how do those symbols then latch on and have meaning to the objects in the world? And this brings us to the distinction between syntax and semantics, which is a really important ontological distinction as well. In ontology, we talk about the syntax all the time, right? How does the sentence get constructed to be well-formed versus the semantics? What does the sentence actually mean? So you can have someone who is syntactically competent. If I tell you that, glarb is a noun and then blargy is an adjective, then I can say that glarb is blargy, and I've come up with a well-formed sentence. But I haven't said anything about what the meaning is, right? I don't know what that adjective refers to. I don't know what that noun refers to. And so we have this new problem, which is a problem of reference. I've talked about this in some of our other ontology videos where we say the cat is on the mat. In virtue of what does the cat, this word, refer to Garfield that sits over there on that mat? But even aside from the language reference issue, we have this thought reference issue. So something that's going on in my mind, in virtue of what does that tie into the natural world in some sort of way? Now, Haugeland's not answering this question here, but we do want to point out that it's not a computer that merely manipulates the symbols and gets the syntax right does not therefore get to count as thinking or as a person or as a mind, because a mind is more than just the symbol manipulation. The thinking is the computation, but it needs to be coupled with the meaning, and that's going to be a high bar to meet. That was a lot of philosophy. Now let's get into the good old-fashioned artificial intelligence, or GOFAI, discussion, and this is the central thesis and definition that Haugeland is proposing in his book. He says, GOFAI, as a branch of cognitive science, rests on a particular theory of intelligence and thought, essentially Hobbes' idea that ratiocination is computation. What does GOFAI amount to? There are two key claims, according to Haugeland. The claims essential to all GOFAI theories are these. 1, our ability to deal with things intelligently is due to our capacity to think about them reasonably. And 2, our capacity to think about things reasonably amounts to a faculty for internal automatic symbol manipulation. So the central definition is that artificial intelligence is GOFAI. It's a symbol manipulation that sits in a certain place in the history of computer science. And what the GOFAI thesis is that artificial minds, machines that actually have minds in the true and literal sense, are the ones that think about things reasonably, where that thought amounts to an automatic sort of symbol manipulation. And this, to Haugeland, is an empirical claim. We're not sure if it's true or not. We'll build some machines. We'll see if they meet this definition. There are going to be other theories that say maybe that neural networks are the core that don't involve any symbol manipulation at all, right? That's all fine. But for Haugeland, this is the definition. This is the very idea, the thing that we're putting forth as artificial intelligence theorists. So let's evaluate this definition. Is this a good bar for us to use? And I'm a positive guy. Let's start with the pros. A lot of them. So first off, it's a testable and open-minded thesis. I really appreciate that about this. There's a claim that there's such a thing that's artificial intelligence, and let's let the chips fall where they may. What things can actually satisfy this, and let's see if those things rise to the level of having actual minds as we think that they ought to. I also like that this theory is stringent. So one of my problems in the previous video with the DARPA conference that says we're a human to do what we'd call it intelligent, well, we're a human to stand in front of my door and only let people in who knew the password. I would consider that intelligent, but I don't want a padlock that's got the password on it to count as intelligent. But on this definition, on Haugeland's, we don't need to count that padlock as artificial intelligence. So that's nice. I also like the plausibility of good old-fashioned artificial intelligence. There's something that feels right about the fact that what it is to think is to be able to take ideas and manipulate them, and that's lines up with manipulating symbols, and that good old-fashioned artificial intelligence is the kind of thing that can do that symbol manipulation, and so is the best candidate for being an artificial mind. Because that's compelling, that feels like a pro for this definition. Also, I'm a sucker for good philosophy, and anyone who spends a lot of time talking about Hobbes and Locke and Descartes as they're trying to lay out their case, I've got a soft spot for that. The other thing that I think is really good here that we haven't seen as much with some of the other definitions is the appeal to strong or AGI. Now, I haven't called out those terms in particular, and we're going to look at that in a future video, but suffice to say that when people are scared of artificial intelligence, we are scared of some sort of almost sentient, all-knowing AI that is going to control the world, right? Well, something with that level of power is much, much stronger than stockfish, even though stockfish can just destroy me in chess and ruin my day. So we want a definition of artificial intelligence that can make sense of or sort of has an obvious slot for that. And I think the sort of thing, the real and serious minds in a very literal sense for artificial intelligence that Haugeland has in mind aligns with that stronger conception of AGI. I guess I am a negative guy. We've got cons. Okay, so the first con, and this one is pretty devastating, is that we started out, like our framework was, there are a bunch of things that we want to call artificial intelligence, and we need a definition that makes sense of that list. We want stockfish and smart cars and ChatGPT and the Terminator and Netflix recommendations to count as artificial intelligence, but none of those things will satisfy Haugeland's definition. Maybe the Terminator would. I'd need to think about that more carefully. But certainly the vast majority of the things that you see on the screen right now don't count on Haugeland's view. And if our goal was to capture these entities, and my definition captures none of them, now my definition is going to need to provide an error theory that says, why don't any of these things count as artificially intelligent? Take this from Haugeland. Sometimes the results are just not in. I'm certainly far from persuaded that it's inevitable. I'm dubious. Near as I can see after 30 years, the hard questions remain open. Now, this is important to note, this was written in 1985, but I think it's fair to say that the advances that we've seen now still don't rise to the level of good old-fashioned artificial intelligence being a mind in the real and literal sense, and so he would still say the jury is out. Another major objection to this view is if we look for reviews of the book, we'll find that folks in the computer science area, in fact, John McCarthy, who featured prominently in our last episode, doesn't think that this captures what is meant by artificial intelligence either. This is what McCarthy has to say. Moreover, it seems to me that GOFAI, his abbreviation of good old-fashioned AI, doesn't rest on the theory that intelligence is computation, an assertion whose vagueness makes me nervous. The theory is that intelligent behavior can be realized computationally. The extent to which human intelligence is realized digitally is a matter for psychologists and physiologists. So McCarthy, when he brings this up, is just like, it seems like you're talking about the wrong stuff. You should be interested in computer science, and instead you're interested in cognitive science and biology. And yeah, physiologists and psychologists can do a lot for us to tell us about like how minds are actually constructed. But that's not what I was setting out to do. And so the huge benefit that we had for our second definition was that it matched practice, right? It shaped the way that computer scientists approach the field. And Haugeland comes in and brings up some interesting philosophical points of view. But when the scientists who are in the artificial intelligence field look at that and say, that's not quite what I was aiming at, that's a big strike against your view. Not decisive, but it does count against it. All right, let's summarize. So our third definition, artificial intelligence is GOFAI, which holds that machines are artificial intelligence insofar as the intelligence is thinking reasonably and that thinking is symbol manipulation. This definition just fails to match our current usage, any of our ostensive cases, with the possible exception of the Terminator, and even John McCarthy seems nonplussed at this as a definition. The quest continues. And we're going to have 2 more episodes. First, we're going to talk about classifications. This is where we'll get some stuff on strong versus weak AI and what AGI amounts to. And then I feel like I have the answer that I would give when someone asks me what's artificial intelligence, and I can't wait to share that with you. Stay tuned. Thanks for this long one. I hope you enjoyed some of the philosophy parts. Please like, subscribe, throw comments below. Let's keep the discussion going. I've really enjoyed some comments from folks lately, and I look forward to seeing more of those. Till next time, everybody.